So let's continue our conversation on First Corinthians. To do that, I'm going to refer to a document that I had looked at before just to go over what the structure is like, and then we'll look at the first few chapters. Once more, we begin after we've got let's see if I can show it to you here, the introduction with the first few verses. And then we start the letter proper after the Thanksgiving in verse 10. And the first and the major issue, divisions and rivalries between apostles, that shows up. That section is, you could track that from 110 pretty much to, I would say, at the end of chapter 4, you have these divisions. And so the first section, this first big section, Paul's responses to the various questions that are put to him, divisions and rivalry. Then there's this issue of incestuous immorality. You've got worldly lawsuits. I'm going to make this a little bigger. And then unrighteous behavior, all of these things. Then you've got this second set. After Paul reproves, that is, he issues criticism, he has these concerns that he wants to address. The first one is marriage and celibacy, which that's a very interesting conversation that Paul has in chapter 7. Then the meat of idolatry, that is the meat that's offered to idols and how people are going to eat. The issue of gender with women in the church, the Lord's Supper, spiritual gifts, all of these things you see have to do with Christian worship. And then spiritual gifts also having to do with worship, but that's where you have chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15. 15 is down here with the resurrection. Spiritual gifts having to do, that's the love chapter. So these are the concerns. If you move over to this side just a bit, let's see if I can move this for you. You get the breakdown of how these sections work. So the divisions and rivalries go to the end of chapter 4. Incest in the church, the lawsuits. These are the major sections and their target passages, so to speak. Unrighteous behavior, marriage, celibacy, eating meat from pagan altars, the placement and the role of women in worship, proper attitude for the Lord's Prayer, the Lord's Supper, and the nature and the role of spiritual gifts, and then the resurrection chapter. So that kind of gives you an idea of the structure. Now here, these little lines going down 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are all recurrences of terms. And let's see if I can have that for you. You can look this up on the page. Send me an email. This is all my work. I'll send it to you. But some of these words that recur, you can find in terms of, I think I had it, words like wisdom, strong and weak, those kinds of issues. I don't want to get bogged down with that kind of minutia just yet. This is just a survey of the first letter. Maybe at another time I can go through it a little more in depth with you. So that's the structure and the content of 1 Corinthians. There are a couple of just, commonly, if you Google image Corinthian archaeology or Corinthian ruins, you're going to see some of these things. A couple of them are breathtaking. This is one you commonly find. You see the Acrocorinth, that really high summit at the top. There was a temple at the top of that. At the moment, I'm drawing a blank as to which temple it was. It seems to me like it was a goddess, but I can't. I'm not going to say maybe Venus. I'm not quite sure. Here's the map I referred to earlier. And if you look at the map a little more in depth, here's Corinth right here. The Peloponnesus is this area. Athens is over here. And here's Corinth right here. So voyagers could navigate their way through, and rather than having to go all around this area, they could send ships from any of the directions and move from there. A couple of other shots of ancient Corinth. Here is the road that would lead you to Rome with the Acrocorinth in the distance. That is the same road. That's not like a road. That is the road Paul would have traversed. And then today, what that spot looks like, if you were to look at it from an airplane, some streets and so anyway, I want to look a little more in depth at 1 Corinthians. And so I think that I have supplied you with a worksheet. I'm going to pull that up so that you can refer to that along with me. Saw it over to the other side of the screen. And this 1 Corinthians shared worksheet you can find on the date for the lecture. I can also make it available on email. If you can't find it, let me know. So chapters 1 through 4, if you have your text, like I have my text, then let me encourage you to get that text out so that you can refer to it. I'm going to move through these things pretty quickly to get us through the first few chapters. Now, we already mentioned that chapters 1 through 4 have to do with the division within the church. So I want to point that out just a little bit for you. And to do so, I will also use our text here. So 1 Corinthians 1. Okay, so Paul is writing to those who are sanctified in Christ Jesus, to those called to be saints. Now, look at how it comes. He first gives a nod to the church. He says that he's calling them to be blameless. He's calling them, to be strengthened. And he knows that they are not lacking any spiritual gift. That's going to be an important feature. But here he starts right away in verse 10. That there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind. That's Paul's main thrust in these first few chapters, is appealing to them not to be so divided one against the other. So look what it says. He gets a report from Chloe's people. We don't necessarily know who Chloe's people are, but they bring back Paul the report about the quarrels. And here are the quarrels. I belong to Paul. I belong to Apollos. I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Cephas, by the way, is Peter. And so is Christ divided? And so he appeals to them that they might have unity. And he says in verse 17, look at what it says, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross might not be emptied of its power. So the divisions of the church form the first major issue. And so if you were looking at your little report here of Chloe's people, or the report of divisions in the church, that would be a major thing. And then the second thing is the status of the believers' status within that church. And we're going to see how that works right now. And he hints at it in verse 17. He hints at it when he says that he doesn't want to empty the gospel, and he's not proclaiming some eloquent wisdom, but rather some kind of a wisdom of the cross, which you're going to find is contrasted with foolishness. This is a major emphasis in the course of the book. Who are the wise ones? Who are the foolish ones? And so, as you've read, look what he says. Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? This is going to be a major kinds of things. The Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified. Again, I'd appeal to you to remember in Acts when Paul visits the Areopagus, and they pretty much ridicule him for his notions about a crucified and then a risen person, a person being raised from the dead. This is who Paul is talking about, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. In other words, not palatable to anybody, but, verse 24, to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So he appeals to them to consider their own vocation and their own wisdom, rather than consider one another wise or foolish. Paul is appealing to the Corinthian believers to be united with him. So he proclaims a Christ crucified. You can look at 1 Corinthians as, on the one hand, dealing with the wisdom of the cross, with crucifixion, but then on the other hand, when you look at the spiritual gifts in 12, 13, and 14, and then the resurrection chapter in chapter 15, that's the other emphasis, isn't it? Where the empty tomb takes precedence. If the wisdom is a wisdom of the cross, then certainly that wisdom plays through in terms of the resurrecting Christ, the resurrected Christ. And so here he appeals to them. And he says he doesn't want faith to rest on human wisdom, but on the power of God. Yet among the mature, we do speak wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age or the realm of this age, who are doomed to perish, but we speak God's wisdom, secret and hidden, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this. If they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. What we're beginning to do here is what's called mirror read. When you have a letter, you only have the letter. You don't have the response. We have the report of Chloe's people. We don't have that report. We have Paul's letter, but we don't necessarily have any information as to what provoked it. But we can make a presumption that if Paul uses this word wisdom over and over and over again, perhaps it became a catchword in that congregation, so that the people would claim a wisdom and then tell others that they, in fact, were foolish. This brings the notion of some kind of a status grab, or the conflict within a congregation when one group tries to take power from another group and uses some kind of a rhetorical ploy. We're the wise ones and you're foolish. You should do what we say. In fact, the letter, the epistle of Clement of Rome to Corinth, that first epistle of Clement, you can see even a little of that in play in that long letter, where it may be a struggle between the young and the old. My doctor father, Larry Wellborn, has written a book about that, a big giant book full of fantastic research, illustrating that Clement may be picking up the division of this church in its iterations between young and old, wise and foolish, between those who have spiritual gifts and those who don't, and may be pointing in the direction of further conflict in this little church. So here comes the Spirit. The Spirit of God reveals things. It searches everything, even the depths of God. So Paul is trying to tread a very thin line, where he wants to emphasize the gifts and the blessing of the Spirit. But on the other hand, he realizes that there are people in the church who may have been using the idea of spiritual gifts in order to shame others in the congregation. So he has to try to show, and this is why chapter 13 comes where it does, that love is the best way forward. So those who are unspiritual do not receive the gifts of the Spirit, for they are foolishness to them. So what is Paul saying? If you want to be wise, you will embrace the foolishness of God. If you want to be wise, you'll embrace the foolishness of God. If you want to be a person who's large in your community, influential, you'll be the servant of all. This is a flipped theology, a flipped anthropology, where instead of wanting to be the top, you want to serve all. That's what Paul is trying to pull off here. Now he gets into the divisions properly, and so he has to change. Now he's going to go at it. He's going to talk about them as infants because they're behaving as infants. And he says no matter who it is, if it's Apollos, if it's him, they all serve, and God puts the entire body together. And we're going to finish this up and move a little forward in the next video.